Hello, my name's Louise Ulrich. Welcome to this session where we'll take a look at some of the more advanced scenarios that are enabled under the Services Provider License Agreement. This module is the fourth of 5 modules that teach you all about SPLA, and it builds on the simple scenarios that we looked at in the first module. Let's start off by looking at the agenda for this session. We're going to start off by looking at some of the different options that exist for a service provider to use SPLA to license software that will run on an end customer's hardware. Then we'll turn our attention to the scenarios that are enabled when end customers have license mobility through software assurance, and if you're not familiar with that, then we'll do a recap, and then we'll consider the scenarios that are enabled with it. Then we'll look at the options that a service provider has when they want to offer end customer solutions that are based on shared hardware. And then we'll turn to the notion of a data center provider, and we'll see that there are 2 key scenarios to know about: when SPLA is used to license the data center and when Microsoft Azure is. Then we'll turn to an important question: to SPLA or not to SPLA? And this is when we'll look at some particular scenarios which must be licensed via SPLA. Then we have a couple of scenarios that represent different solutions that a service provider can offer their end customers, and then we'll finish with some options for managed Office 365 ProPlus solutions. Let's get started. So in this first section, we're going to look at some scenarios where the end customer owns the hardware, and we'll see what solutions a service provider can offer to provide software services through their SPLA agreement to the end customer. In our first example, the end customer wants to own the server hardware and to outsource the licensing of the infrastructure, but to own and manage the software licenses for the applications. And this is what the solution looks like. You can see we have the hardware owned by the end customer, and that's shown by the asset tag. And you can see virtual machines running on that server. And because the virtual machines also have the end customer's asset tag, you can see that this server is completely dedicated to the end customer's use. Then you can see licenses assigned to cover the infrastructure, shown by Windows Server, and licenses assigned to cover the applications running in the virtual machines. And what's the solution in this scenario? Well, the hardware is owned by the end customer, but the infrastructure is licensed by the service provider under their SPLA agreement and then charged to the end customer as a software service. Note that the service provider is allowed to do this as long as the server is under their day-to-day management and control. And with the infrastructure licensed in this way, the end customer may still use the licenses they have acquired through a volume licensing program to license the applications. In this next example, the end customer wants an even more complete solution. They will still own the hardware, but want the licensing of both the infrastructure and the applications provided as a service. So you can see the resulting solution. We can see that the end customer owns the hardware, shown by the asset tag, and it will be dedicated to them. All virtual machines, for instance, will be used by them. But this time they own none of the licenses. None of them are yellow. In this situation, the service provider uses his SPLA agreement to license both the infrastructure and the applications. Let's now look at some solutions that service providers could offer from their own data centres. Our first example is using license mobility through software assurance rights, and here the end customer is interested in outsourcing both the ownership and management of the hardware as well as the licensing of the infrastructure, but they do want to own and manage the software licenses for the applications. You can see that the solution involves a service provider owning and managing the hardware and licensing the infrastructure through their SPLA agreement. And if the end customer does have software assurance on their volume licensing licenses, then they are indeed allowed to use these licenses to license the workloads in a virtual machine on the service provider's server farm. And the service provider may use this hardware for multiple end customers, as you can see in the diagram. Note that both the yellow and the green licenses here are volume licenses. I've used different colours to indicate that solutions for different end customers may exist on the same hardware. In this next example, the end customer is interested in a fully licensed off-site solution, so they won't own any hardware or software at all. So again, you can see that the service provider owns and manages the hardware, and he licenses both the infrastructure and the applications through SPLA. Now, in addition, you can see that some virtual machines may be dedicated to end customers, the yellow one shown here, but actually it's permissible for these virtual machines to be shared between end customers too. And we can see the grey and green end customers sharing the second virtual machine there. This next example provides the end customer again with a fully licensed off-site solution, but this time it involves two service providers, and let's call them, quite imaginatively, A and B. Now, one of the service providers, A, acts as a data center provider, and they own and manage the hardware, and they license the infrastructure using their SPLA agreement, and these licenses are shown in blue as usual. Then there is another service provider, B, who uses the infrastructure of service provider A and then licenses the applications through his own SPLA agreement. So he will charge the yellow and green end customers for the solution that's provided, and then he will report the application licenses to his SPLA reseller, and then pay service provider A a fee for the infrastructure services. Service provider A, in turn, will report the infrastructure licenses to his SPLA reseller. Now, the last point I'll make here is that service provider B does need to check that the products he chooses to license are eligible to be licensed in this way. This is easy to check. He simply needs to go to the SPR, the Services Provider Use Rights document, and check that there is a Yes flag next to the Eligible for Software Services on Data Center Providers attribute for the product that he wants to license. Now, we've looked at quite a lot of scenarios, and it's true that in many cases SPLA is an option when it comes to deciding how to license a particular scenario. However, there are times when it's not an option. It's the only way to license a scenario, and I thought it would be worth taking a look at an example of one of these scenarios now. On the left-hand side of the diagram, you can see Contoso, of course, who are a company who have set up an online bookstore where their customers come and buy books. Now, how should this be licensed? Well, Contoso's customers here are their external users, and so Contoso can license this situation through a volume licensing agreement and buy licenses such as external connector licenses to license those users. But on the right-hand side of the diagram, we have Fabricam. Now, Fabricam have a book-selling solution too, but it's significantly different from the Contoso one. What Fabricam have done is to set up an infrastructure for publishers to sell books to their own customers. And because it's not Fabricam's direct customers who are buying from the sites, then this scenario qualifies as a commercial hosting scenario, which isn't allowed under a volume licensing agreement and therefore must be licensed through SPLA. We could take another example of a bank who provide a free web app. Now, the bank doesn't sell its financial services to its customers. The app just allows customers to buy and sell stock, and it enables independent buyers and sellers to trade shares of other companies. And again, because the customers are not buying services directly from the bank, this is a commercial hosting scenario, which again has to be licensed through SPLA. And you'll note in this last example that even though the bank aren't charging for their app, it's free. This doesn't change the underlying requirement to license the scenario through SPLA. So we've looked at hardware owned by the end customer or the service provider and licenses acquired through different agreements. But let's now add Microsoft Azure into the mix and see what further solutions are enabled. You may be thinking that we've already covered this scenario, and you're almost right. The license mobility through software assurance rights allow an end customer with SA on his application server licenses to assign those licenses either to a service provider's shared hardware, which is indeed what we looked at a few slides ago, or in fact to a virtual machine running on Azure, which is what this slide covers. You can see that I've represented the Microsoft data center with Azure services by the server with virtual machines on the left of the screen, and the little clouds represent the infrastructure being provided through Azure. We looked at the license verification process in Module 2 in this series, and the same form is used whether an end customer assigns licenses to a service provider server farm or to Azure. But let's now turn our attention to looking at Azure from the point of view of the sorts of solutions that a service provider can provide to his end customers. This example covers using Azure as a data center provider, and again we've looked at the notion of a data center provider already, where we had service provider A who was providing infrastructure services for service provider B. This gives service provider B an alternative. He can use his SPLA agreement to license applications running on an infrastructure on Azure to sell fully licensed software services to his end customers. So here you see Azure providing the infrastructure, shown by the little clouds, and then the blue licenses showing the service provider using his SPLA agreement to license applications for his yellow and green end customers. We talked about the need to check that the products are allowed to be run on data center providers' servers, and the same is true here. The service provider must check that any applications he licenses on this Azure infrastructure are eligible for software services on data center providers. So far, many of the solutions we've looked at concern the licensing of the Microsoft applications, perhaps SharePoint delivered as a software service, for example. But what I want to look at here is when the service provider wants to build his own customer solutions and provide them through Azure. Here you can see I've made the applications blue to indicate that these are solutions provided by the service provider. You can also see that I've licensed these applications where appropriate with SPLA. Now, is this possible? Well, yes it is, on one condition. The customer solution must be just that. There needs to be primary and significant functionality added to the Azure services to make it a customer solution. And then something called an Azure hosting exception makes this perfectly acceptable. The service provider is then able to use his SPLA agreement to, for instance, license RDS functionality for the users in his end customers as required. And the final scenario in this section touches on how a service provider may provide managed service solutions in Azure. You can see in the diagram here that there are two end customers that the service provider is providing a managed service to. The service provider is making the Azure services available for their end customers' own solutions, and that's why I've coloured the applications. There are some conditions for this scenario detailed in the Online Services Terms document, but in essence, the service provider must have sole access to configure and administer the Azure services, and the end customer has administrative access to its own virtual machines and the applications running on those virtual machines. And here the coloured applications also indicate that they're under the control of the end customer, and they would be responsible, where appropriate, for licensing these applications. The final thing to consider in this section is actually something we haven't yet talked about at all. How does the service provider pay for the Azure services that they're basing their solutions on? Well, they could buy direct from Microsoft through the customer portal, but if they're consuming significant amounts of Azure, then it's likely to be better for them to pay for the services through the server and cloud enrolment. This is a volume licensing agreement, and it's a very good, cost-effective way for the service provider to pay for the services that they consume. So in all the previous examples, consider that an SCE is an optional part of the solution for the service provider. So in this diagram, you can see that the service provider has a single SCE agreement that enables him to buy Azure services and to offer solutions to his end customers, and that's whether it's a SPLA license solution for the yellow end customer or a managed service solution for the green end customer. And finally, let's look at how service providers can offer managed Office 365 ProPlus solutions. In this first example, the service provider is managing an Office 365 ProPlus solution on his own hardware, and for the first time we're seeing two servers. This is because if the service provider wants to provide this managed Office 365 ProPlus solution, then he must have hardware dedicated to each end customer. So you can see here that he has a yellow end customer and a green end customer, and both end customers have a dedicated server where the service provider is managing Office 365 ProPlus for them. But what other licenses are involved here? Well, you can see the service provider has used SPLA to license the physical servers from an infrastructure perspective, and he'll also use SPLA to report RDS cells for all of the users who need access to the managed service in the end customer. The final part of the picture is how Office 365 ProPlus is licensed. This product isn't available through SPLA, but the service provider can offer a complete solution by selling Office 365 ProPlus licenses to his end customer through the Cloud Reseller program. And in this case, it's the end customer who is the licensee through an agreement called the Microsoft Cloud Agreement, and I've marked these licenses on the diagram as a pink license. The rights for the end customer to use their licenses in this way, so to have Office 365 ProPlus installed and managed on a dedicated network server by a partner, is allowed through something called shared computer activation rights. And the final example is another option for a service provider to manage an Office 365 ProPlus solution, this time through Azure. You can see here that this service provider has two end customers, a grey one and a green one, and he's using Azure as the infrastructure for his Office 365 ProPlus solution. You can see the little clouds indicating that the infrastructure is provided through Azure, and as we said, service provider is likely to license that through the server and cloud enrolment. Again, the service provider has sold Office 365 ProPlus licenses to the end customer through the Cloud Reseller program, and they're shown in pink as usual. And again, the rights for the end customer to use their licenses in this way, so in this situation to have Office 365 ProPlus installed and managed on Azure, is allowed through those shared computer activation rights. And as before, RDS is part of the solution, and you can see that I've put a couple of options on the diagram here. For the grey end customer, the service provider has reported RDS cells for the users in the end customer through his SPLA agreement, whereas the green end customer actually has RDS user cals with ActiveSA, and he's allowed to assign them for use in this scenario. Well, that concludes our session on some of the many different licensing scenarios involving SPLA. Your task now should be to take the associated exam on the Get Licensing Ready site, and remember to download the handout for reference. There is one more module in the SPLA track called Cloud Portability, which goes through a number of scenarios showing how customers can take their existing licenses and move to a cloud solution. There's a lot of interesting information in this module, and I'd certainly recommend that you work through it.